Thanks a lot for Dr. Wang for the introduction, and also thanks a lot for the conference organizer to invite me to give this talk and share my findings and results with the audience. Let me check one thing. Can I use the sharing function on my computer, because it seems like yes, right now it's open. Okay, so basically, again, like what Professor Wang has just said, I'm going to talk about the relationship between social media and political polarization in times of contention, or a little bit more precisely, I will slightly adjusted the title of the talk into digital media radicalization and opinion polarization during protest movement. Now, obviously, the topic of the talk deals with the main theme of the conference, that is political polarization, but I would put it in a slightly different context. Slightly different context in the sense that, most studies in political communication and political science, they examine partisan polarization or ideological polarization. Previous studies mostly studied this topic in the context of elections and democracies, electoral democracies. What has been examined to a lesser extent are polarization in semi-democratic or non-democratic context, and polarization in association with protest movements. There have been a lot of very important protest movements in the world, across the world, in the past 10 years, ranging from Arab Spring to Occupy Wall Street to Umbrella Movement, Sunflower Movement, the anti-elect protests in Hong Kong, and what is currently happening in Thailand and other countries. But there has not been a lot of research on how polarization occurs in the context of these protest movements. So one question that has been driving part of my research in the past few years is how do the trend of public opinion polarization and the dynamics of social movements relate to each other. Of course, as a researcher from journalism and communication, I'm also naturally interested in the role of media and communication in political polarization. There has been a classic argument pinpointing the importance of the proliferation of media outlets and over-implementation in the role of in the process of facilitating public opinion polarization. I will explain that a little bit more in a few minutes. But few studies have examined the implications of multiple types of media platforms and channels simultaneously. So another question that I would want to talk about later on today is how does the range of media and communication factors relate to opinion polarization at the individual level. I will focus my talk on largely my own research, which deals largely with the Hong Kong experience. In the past 10 to 12 years, Hong Kong has experienced the rise of social mobilization since the early 2000s. The services exhibited higher levels of generalized protest potential and collective advocacy over time, and more social groups were willing to participate in or organize protests. However, besides the overall increase, in addition to the overall increase of social mobilization, there has also been a trend of radicalization of protests. As protests became more common, they also became more routinized. And when protests become more routinized, they actually become less disruptive and less effective. So in that process, a lot of activists and movement groups in Hong Kong started to try to adopt more radical, more disruptive protest tactics or more radical ideology. So there has been a gradual process of radicalization in social movements over time, signified in particular by the Umbrella Movement in 2004 and the anti-extradition bill movement last year and early this year. At the same time, for the past 2 decades, public opinion in Hong Kong toward the government had also become more polarized over time. As the graph here shows, I was calculating using a certain formula that I will introduce later on to calculate, the degree to which public opinion toward the government in Hong Kong was polarized. And this graph shows that between year 2003 and year 2015, degree of polarization of public opinion in their evaluation of government and degree of polarization in trust toward Hong Kong government had both increased gradually over time. So this has been the background and trend. So these are some of the background and considerations that kind of drive my research in the past few years. So a few years ago, I published a paper, and I would like to talk a little bit about this paper first, about use 10 minutes to talk about this book. I published one paper on the impact of social media on political polarization in varying times. Okay, so basically it deals with the umbrella movement experience and the role of social media in polarization. So in that article, what I did was to try to summarize and put forward the whole compare and contrast different kinds of arguments about how social media might relate to opinion polarization. So on the one hand, there has been, as I mentioned earlier, a moment ago, there has been a classic argument linking social media to opinion polarization. The argument runs like this: the advance of the internet and digital media created a situation in which number of media outlets proliferate. So it created a high-choice media environment in which selective exposure became even more common, even a stronger tendency. And the rise of social media further strengthened the tendency of selective exposure because people tend to be connected with like-minded others. The result is that people become situated in filter bubbles or echo chambers, and when people communicate mainly within their own echo chambers and filter bubbles, opinions become reinforced and they become more extreme, and so polarization is the result. I'm sure that the audience members here probably are very familiar with this line about. But at the same time, in the literature of political communication, there has been a number of arguments against this classic argument. A number of scholars have argued that maybe the situation is somewhat more complicated or not as simple as this. Some scholars argue that, well, you have to distinguish between selective exposure and selective avoidance. People having the tendency to be selectively exposed to like-minded contents does not mean that they will avoid unlike-minded content. So the two cannot be equated. Connection with like-minded others is also a matter of degree. Natural heterogeneity is a fact of life because politics may not be considered particularly important. So you would, even though people might have a tendency to talk to like-minded others, but in our social life, we are indeed connected with people with different political attitudes. When you go to work, you don't pick your work, you don't pick your job because of your political value. Okay, you don't pick your colleagues based on political value. All of us are born into a family. We cannot choose our siblings or parents or children. Okay, and sometimes even within the family, people simply have different political values. So natural heterogeneity is a fact of life. Okay, the overall implication here is that a degree of cross-cutting exposure, after all, is the norm rather than the exception, even on social media. So in this case, it kind of complicates the earlier argument, saying that maybe the idea that social media will contribute to echo chamber might not be as simple as that. Now, comparing these two arguments, and then I add my own argument here, is that, okay, because there are competing considerations, my argument in that part of the article is that the significance of the immediate context, I highlighted the significance of the so-called immediate context. Social media do have some polarizing potential, but social media's polarizing potential is more likely to be realized in a polarizing context. And what I mean by a polarizing context is a context in which political debates are extraordinarily heated and where people are already predisposed to look at their opponents critically and actively. It is the type of context in which politics becomes more important and people may indeed exercise selective exposure to political information more proactively. It's the type of context in which people start to unfriend others with their views. Normally, as I said, in our social networks, we have people, we have friends and colleagues, acquaintances of different political views. Normally, we just stay connected with them. But in a very polarizing context, in a very heated context, some people might start to unfriend others because of political views. A polarizing context is also the type of context in which people's discourses can become, or the way they speak, the way they talk, can become particularly emotional and unstable. Okay, so based on these arguments, in that part of the paper, I posited the umbrella movement in a polarizing context, and several hypotheses were proposed, including at a collective level, public attitude toward the movement, toward the umbrella movement, and the Hong Kong government has become more polarized over the course of the movement. The second to fourth hypothesis are hypotheses at the individual level. political communication via social media at the individual level is positively related to extremity of people's opinion toward the movement. So social media use basically make people's opinions more extreme. That's the hypothesis. However, H3 argues that persists that the context matters. So the relationship between political communication via social media and opinion extremity is stronger during a polarizing context like the umbrella movement than before the movement. Before the movement, the context was relatively less polarizing. So the relationship between social media use and opinion extremity should be stronger during the umbrella movement and weaker before the umbrella movement. And the fourth hypothesis for communication via social media is positively related to extremity of people's level of trust toward police and government during the umbrella movement. Okay, so in that study, I basically used various survey data sources, and polarization in that particular study is understood as an attribute of opinion distribution. So a more polarized the popular opinion distribution on a variable is marked by modality and high levels of dispersion. And so I created this formula, okay, to take into account both by modality and dispersion, and then created a score, an overall score of polarization to describe an opinion distribution. And this particular formula is applicable to testing the hypothesis of opinion polarization at a collective level. And then at the individual level, the issue is how extreme people's attitudes and opinions are. So for the first hypothesis, the article draws upon a series of 4 surveys conducted during the umbrella movement. For the 3 hypotheses at the individual level, the article draws upon 2 surveys conducted in March 2003, about 18 months before the umbrella movement, kind of relatively less polarizing context, and October 2014 during the umbrella movement, respectively. So very quickly, the findings here shows that the most important thing is the polarization score. So the exact numbers are kind of abstract. It's less important. The most important point is that in line with the expectation, in line with the hypothesis, polarization in terms of support for the movement did increase over time. From September, the score was 36.9, going up to 41.1 in October, going up to 42.5 and 42.7 in November and December. Trust toward the Hong Kong government, also polarization in people's trust toward the Hong Kong government also increased from 11.6 in September to 18.8 in December. So we see there has been a rise of popular opinion polarization during the huge protest movement. And then at the individual level, we see that in the 2014 survey, the survey conducted during the umbrella movement, there was indeed a significant relationship, positive relationship, between political communication via social media and attitude extremity. The dependent variable for this table is attitude extremity. Okay, it is significant, but in the 2013 survey, it's actually not significant. So it is in line with the idea that the relationship between social media and opinion polarization, attitude extremity, is basically applicable mainly when the context is polarizing. But interestingly, what we see here is that even for political discussion, okay, it's the same. Political discussion has a positive and significant relationship with attitude extremity only in the 2014 survey and not in the 2013 survey. And then when it comes to extremity of trust toward the Hong Kong police, extremity of trust toward the Hong Kong government and toward the Chinese government, 2021 data from the October 2014 survey also found that social media political communication was positively related to attitude extremity toward the Hong Kong police and toward the Hong Kong government. However, again, news exposure and political discussion also related significantly and positively to attitude extremity here. So basically, that in that earlier study, what we found is that polarization was a constant trend in Hong Kong society, even before the umbrella movement occurred. But the umbrella movement seemingly aggravated the trend. Social media use related to more extreme attitudes mainly during the protest movement, but not before. The relationship between social media and opinion extremity, however, is not specific to social media. It seems from the earlier study that a range of other communication activities also related to more extreme attitudes. Now, this is the earliest study, but there was a few limitations or few issues that I want to address in my later study, especially in the study that I'm going to introduce about the anti-media movement. So what that earlier study didn't do, okay? So in that earlier study, digital and social media were grouped together into one single thing. Okay, so there was no differentiation among the various digital and social media platforms. However, in reality, as I will introduce later, the implications of online alternative media, private messaging apps like Line and WhatsApp, and specific social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., to be rather different because the different media platforms might have different types of contents and different types of structures and audiences. So a more differentiated approach might allow us to develop a more nuanced understanding of the role of digital and social media in polarization. This is the first thing that I want to address in my later analysis. The second thing is that in that earlier study, I just treat umbrella movement as a context, and there was actually very little consideration of what actually happened during the movement. So the aggregate level analysis showed the trend toward higher levels of polarization, but other than the possible increase of communication activities at the individual level, there was no consideration of the dynamics of the umbrella movement itself. Like there was actually during the umbrella movement, there was actually an urge toward radicalization among movement supporters toward the later stage of the protest campaign. And there were also various anti-movement frames propagated by the government and pro-government forces to undermine public support for the movement. And these factors were not actually, were not really considered in the earlier study. So what I would like to address in my latest study is how the movement dynamics like these may relate to media use on the one hand, and to political polarization on the other. And then the third thing is that the third thing to know about the earlier study is the way I measure and conceptualize polarization. So I use the kind of polarization that talk about mainly a distributional kind of definition. But in the literature, there are actually three different ways to conceptualize and operationalize polarization. To focus on polarization as an attribute of an opinion distribution, to focus on ideological consistency, or to focus on what a lot of people actually have been measuring and testing is actually effective polarization. That is the degree to which people actually hate or be hostile toward the other side. Of course, the three types of polarization are probably correlated, but they remain conceptually distinct. And effective polarization is a central concern in many existing studies. And so in my latest study, I would want to shift my operationalization and conceptualization from a more distributional concern to a concern with effective polarization. And so these lead into my analysis of the relationship between digital media and opinion polarization during the anti-media movement from Songzhong in 2019 and 2020. I'm sure that the audience members are actually quite familiar with the background already, but just to go through the basic background, the movement was originating from the opposition to the Hong Kong SAR government's proposal to amend the fugitive ordinance. The protest actually began in March and April 2019. It was renamed, kind of reframed to a matter of so-called Contention. And this reframing was actually very effective in arousing public concern because the reframing effectively resonated with the public's fear about the possible abuse of the law. There was a wave of online petition in May, and then there was a 1 million strong protest on June 9th, surrounding of the Legislative Council building on June 12th, and a 2 million strong protest on June 16th. The anti-media movement itself takes up a lot of characteristics of what sociologists Michael Castells called a natural social movement. Even after the Hong Kong SAR government announced the suspension of the bill on June 13th, the process did not stop because the Hong Kong government's action, partly because the Hong Kong government's action fell short of retracting the bill, and also partly because the clashes between the police and the protesters on June 12th had already led to a shift of the protesters' emphasis to police actions and the situation of the arrested protesters. So by early July, the movement demand has evolved into or crystallized into what we call the last or 5 demands, including retraction of the bill, including bill demands related to investigating police and also democratic reform. The process continued until mid-January 2020 before being undermined by the COVID-19 outbreak. I know these are just a very simple background of the movement, but again, what I'm going to test, what I'm going to interrogate is the relationship among three things: digital media, radicalization, the dynamics of radicalization, and opinion polarization. So in my analysis, what I'm trying to do is actually to differentiate again. Instead of treating digital and social media as one single thing, I wanted in this particular analysis to differentiate among four different things, okay? The first is online alternative media. So online alternative media had long been shown in past research in Hong Kong to relate to both protest participation and oppositional knowledge among citizens. They played a highly significant role in the movement. So for example, in the Hong Kong part of the digital news report by Rogers Institute of Study of Journalism, Stand News, is the only news organization registering an increase in public trust between 2019 and 2020. That is between year 2019 and 2020, public trust in Hong Kong, public trust toward the media. Various media organizations almost all went down. The only exception was Stand News, which was just an increase in public trust. And the specificity of Stand News is that it is an online media, largely a pro-movement media, and through its reporting, live coverage of protest events, etc., gained much public recognition and support. So this is the situation of alternative media online. And then the second thing I will look into is the very prominent online forum called Keynote. So it then became the central communication platform for movement participants. It was a very important source of information for protesters. In a series of on-site protest surveys, during the protest, I and my colleagues conducted a series of actually 26 surveys during 26 different protest events. And in almost every single protest event, we asked the protesters what are their most important sources of information. And from those surveys, we found that the importance of the event as a source of movement information increased from on a 5-point scale, 3.57 in early July to around 4.3 in September. It actually became a major platform for the articulation of criticisms against the government and new discourses in response to ongoing happenings. And among the protesters, according to our analysis of the on-site survey data, among the protesters' views and consumption of the internet was significantly related to more positive attitude toward radical actions, stronger feelings of solidarity, and adoption of emerging discourses and power. So that's the second type of digital social media that I'm going to look at in the later analysis. The third type is the kind of more typical, the most popular social media in Hong Kong, Facebook, and the messaging and WhatsApp. So these are the most widely utilized social media in the city. Now, in past research in Hong Kong, Facebook use was only found to be related to protest participation. However, if we look at the nature and the basic affordances of social media sites like Facebook and messaging like WhatsApp, what we can argue is that both Facebook and WhatsApp are embodiment of what sociologists, like Barry Wyman and Lucas have called network individualism. That is when you use Facebook, when you use WhatsApp, you are, of course, you are basically connected with people in your own network. You are network media. These are networking media. But at the same time, it's network individualism in the sense that every one of us is at the center of our own network on these social media sites. Okay, so on your own Facebook account, on your own Line account, you are at the center of your network. So, and WhatsApp in particular is a channel that privatizes public communication and is particularly likely to facilitate the formation of filter bubbles. And then the fourth thing that I would, fourth thing related to digital media and communication that I'd like to look at is it's not so much a media platform, but just the actual idea or actual phenomenon of cross-cutting exposure. That is the degree to which people recognize that they were exposed to disagreeable views regardless of platforms and channels. According to a line of communication research in the past 20 years, cross-cutting exposure should lead to ambivalence and feelings of social accountability, and is likely to undermine attitude toward extremity and opinion polarization. So basically, this is the summary of the 4 things. So basically, I am examining 4 different types of digital media and communication, 2 online alternative media and art, quote-unquote pro-movement. Okay, these media are mainly perpetrating or publicizing pro-movement content. Therefore, because of the content are being pro-movement, so that both online alternative media and are expected to strengthen movement supporters' attitude and weaken opponents' attitude. Okay, both online alternative media. However, Facebook and WhatsApp, as just argued, because of the nature of characteristic natural individualism, I characterize them as being, instead of being pro-movement, they are being pro-self. You are yourself on these social media, and you are surrounded mostly by like-minded people. So the content that you receive are largely expected to be largely supportive toward yourself. So it's a kind of pro-self media. So the implication on users should be strengthen both supporters and opponents. That is, no matter what you support or oppose to the anti-elect movement on these social media sites, you receive contents that are likely to reinforce your own attitude. Okay, so we strengthen both movement supporters and opponents' attitude. Whereas, in contrast, cross-cutting exposure, by definition, is pro-other, is anti-self. Okay, so it should weaken both movement supporters and opponents' attitude. So these are the range of media and communication factors that I would like to interrogate into. And then, the second factor of the trial, okay, digital media radicalization, polarization. So the second factor is dynamics of radicalization in the movement. And when we talk about radicalization, we are basically talking about the adoption of action tactics or the adoption of ideologies that deviate from existing norms to ever larger extent. Okay, so we can differentiate radicalization into tactical radicalization and ideological radicalization. And tactical radicalization refers to the adoption of more and more radical tactics over the months. And in fact, in the anti-elect movement, we saw that there was a very clear process of tactical radicalization, from the use of umbrellas, setting roadblocks, and throwing bricks in June, to attacking police in Paris in July, to the use of gunfire and petrol bombs in August, to vandalizing and vigilantism actually in September and October. So there has been a trend toward tactical radicalization among the participants. And ideological radicalization, there was also a trend of ideological radicalization. The so-called 5 demands are actually very modern. If you ask for the tracking the bill, democratic reform, these are actually very modern demands. But in July, August, and September, a lot of participants started to create, to construct, to articulate, or to use somewhat more radical slogans like, the Great Hong Kong Revolution at the time emerged in late July and August as a more radical slogan, even though it was actually kept ambiguous for a long period of time. That is, how to understand the Great, how to understand revolution. It was kept ambiguous for a long period of time. And Hong Kong independence became more prominent in publicized only toward the end of year 1992. But in any case, the point here is that there has been a trend, a gradual trend toward ideological radicalization too. Okay. In fact, just for background, I and my colleagues have actually just published another paper, our paper is accepted by a journal, which talks about radicalization itself. If we look at radicalization of the movement itself, okay, actually we adopted a certain theoretical framework, the kind of interactive dynamics framework on social movement studies, and we have in separate articles explicated radicalization in terms of interactions between the movement and its environment, between the movement and speculative forces, between the movement and behind the movement, and within the movement. Okay, interactions of actions. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but the point here is to note that radicalization itself is a trend, and as a movement dynamics, of course, we have this own various kinds of forces, various kinds of forces. Okay, but here in the present analysis, what I'm concerned with is how individuals' attitude toward radical targets and ideologies relate to digital media use at one end, and to political polarization at the other. And then the third thing in the trio is, of course, polarization itself. And as I mentioned, very simple, I will understand polarization in this analysis in terms of affective polarization. That is how movement supporters and opponents feel themselves at opposite camp. And the kind of conceptual model or framework is very simple. Okay, what I'm trying to test, what I'm trying to illustrate is how communication relates to radicalism and then relates to affective polarization. What polarization should be at the end is how communication relates to affective polarization. Both, possibly directly, there is always the possibility of a more direct relationship, but at the same time also possibly mediated by radicalism. Okay, so I set up a number of hypotheses for that. For the relationship between media communication and radicalism, so I set up 3 hypotheses. Consumption of pro-movement media should be related to higher levels of acceptance toward more radical targets and ideologies. For whoever, no matter who you are, no matter what your pre-existing attitude is, the more you consume pro-movement media, the more likely you become receptive or at least less opposed to radical targets and ideologies. Social media use, however, would strengthen movement supporters' receptiveness toward radical targets and ideologies, but weakens movement opponents' receptiveness toward radical targets and ideologies. Again, the impact of social media use is likely to vary according to pre-existing attitudes. In force, social media use are likely to convey messages that reinforce people's pre-existing attitudes. And cross-cutting exposure, in contrast, should weaken movement supporters' receptiveness toward radical targets and ideologies, and strengthens movement opponents' receptiveness toward radical targets and ideologies. So these are 3 hypotheses about the relationship between media communication and radicalism. And then the next 2 hypotheses are about the relationship between radicalism and movement polarization. So for movement supporters, acceptance of radical targets and ideologies should be related to stronger affective polarization. The more radical the movement supporters are, the more receptive they are to radical targets. They probably also have stronger affective stances toward their own side and the other side. Okay, so there should be stronger affective polarization. And for movement opponents, stronger opposition toward radical targets and ideologies should be related to stronger affective polarization. And then the third set of hypotheses, H6 to H8, deal with the possible direct relationship between communication and polarization. So consumption of pro-movement media, including alternative media, and can lead to more positive views toward movement participants and less positive views toward movement opponents. Therefore, it should strengthen affective polarization among movement supporters, but weakens affective polarization among movement opponents. Social media use can mainly strengthen existing attitudes. I would presume that that would settle. So they mainly strengthen pre-existing attitudes. Therefore, social media use is expected to strengthen affective polarization among both movement supporters and movement opponents. In contrast, cross-cutting exposure is expected to weaken existing attitudes, hence it can weaken affective polarization among both movement supporters and movement opponents. I am testing these relationships, these arguments in a survey conducted a few months ago in June 2020. It's a kind of pretty large survey with 1,574 respondents. So very quickly about some of the measures. So basically, I asked them very straightforwardly, do you support or oppose the anti-IRAC movement? That is, this question helped me to differentiate people into supporters, opponents of the movement, or whether they're neutral towards the movement. Affective polarization, I asked the respondents the feelings toward participants of the anti-IRAC movement to rate their feelings from very negative 0 to 10 or very positive, as well as feelings towards supporters of the government, so feelings towards 2 sides. So affective polarization is differential between the kind of directional differential. So for movement supporters, affective polarization is their feelings toward their own side, participants of anti-IRAC movement, minus their feelings towards supporters of the government. And for movement opponents, it's the opposite. It's the feeling towards opponents of government, my experience towards participants of the anti-level. Okay. Media use, well, sorry for those oops. Sorry for those strange forms. Okay, so for media use, I asked a set of questions. How often do you get public affairs information from 4 different things? Traditional media such as TV, radio, and newspaper, online media such as fan news and HO01, which is 50% online media, and then online forums such as Lindang, and social media such as WhatsApp and Facebook. These items will be used individually in the analysis to represent the different types of media. And then cross-cutting exposure, I asked 3 questions. On the anti-Iran movement, whether there are many family members holding similar views, on the anti-Iran movement, whether there are many friends holding similar views as you, and overall speaking, how frequently do you get in touch with views different from yours on the internet? The higher the score, supposedly the stronger, the larger the cross-cutting pressure. However, interestingly, these 3 items actually correlated with each other very, very weakly. Okay, apparently, having a very heterogeneous, family does not mean that you will have a very heterogeneous friendship group. So the 2 are very different from each other. So that the 3 items here are not very strongly correlated with each other, and so in the later analysis, I will actually just treat them as individual variables. Okay. Tactical radicalism, people's attitude toward tactical radicalism, I asked the response is how acceptable do you think the following actions are, which include a series of relatively more radical actions that have been carried out by the protesters during the anti-Iran movement, including stopping metro and government departments from operating, cramming the airport, damaging metro and traffic lights, vandalizing tactical shops, using physical force against people disagreeing with themselves as vigilantism, and using Molotov cocktails. I created an index by averaging the 6 items into one single thing on tactical radicalism. And then on ideological radicalism, I asked people about their attitude or their views toward Hong Kong events. I did not ask them to directly support or oppose, but I created a number of statements. The first 2 statements are statements that are representing people views that are most sympathetic toward the idea of Hong Kong events. If democracy and freedom in Hong Kong worsen, continue to worsen, one needs to consider Hong Kong. And the second item reads, although it is not necessarily worth supporting, it is fine for society to publicly discuss Hong Kong events. So these 2 items are relatively sympathetic or receptive toward Hong Kong independence. The third and fourth item are negative. Okay, Hong Kong is too small and has too little resource. Independence is not good. It's that the Chinese central government will not allow Hong Kong independence, so striving for independence will only bring negative consequences. So, and I combine the 4 statements in a specific way. Average the first 2 statements and then use the average to minus the average of the last 2 statements and create an overall score on people's attitude toward Hong Kong independence. Okay, so with these variables, I just run a set of regression to test the relationship between the communication variables and first of all, radicalism. So when tactical radicalism is used as dependent variable, we see that traditional media use actually reduces tactical radicalism for both movement supporters and movement opponents. I did not, create hypothesis for traditional media, but actually having an active relationship between traditional media consumption and radicalism among all people actually is consistent with our general understanding, with Hong Kong researchers' general understanding of the point that traditional media in Hong Kong these days are very conservative usually. Online foreign consumption, we can see here, actually relates significantly to tactical radicalism, but mainly among the conservatives. Now, cross-cutting exposure, especially through friends and through family, or actually reduces tactical radicalism, but only among movement supporters. I will summarize these things later on, but let me just go through and describe the findings first. And the second set of regression analysis deals with the relationship between digital media communication and ideological radicalism. So again, traditional media use actually reduces both radical radicalism and here ideological radicalism for both movement supporters and movement opponents. The use of online forum increases ideological radicalism mainly among movement supporters. And then social media use actually reduces ideological radicalism mainly among movement opponents. I'm showing this in red because this is actually an interesting finding that social media use also reduces ideological radicalism among movement supporters. I'm showing this in red because it's actually contrary to what we would have expected. Okay, the ones in green are actually consistent with what we would expect. The one in black here is actually contrary with our expectation. And then cross-cutting exposure reduces ideological radicalism among movement supporters and increases ideological radicalism among movement opponents. Okay, so these are actually related, kind of in line with our expectation. And then the third set of hypotheses, the third set of regression has I'm using affective polarization as DB. So the third set of regression analysis deals with how media use and radicalism relate to affective polarization. So in model 1, when the radicalism variables are not added, we see that cross-cutting exposure actually reduces affective polarization, which is actually in line with expectation, and especially cross-cutting exposure with examiners. In fact, even within the full model, even after radicalism is taken into account, we still see that cross-cutting exposure within the vector context can reduce affective polarization. Traditional media use also reduce affective polarization, but only among movement supporters. Use of online forum increases affective polarization, but only among movement supporters. And the relationship is going away when radicalism is introduced. And in line with our expectation, radicalism indeed relates to affective polarization differently for movement supporters and for movement opponents. For movement supporters, their radicalism drives their affective polarization. For movement opponents, their lesser opposition. It's of course, when movement supporters, when we say movement opponents, they are not radical. They are actually less opposed to when they are less opposed to radical radicalism, when they are less opposed to home independence, they actually also have implication of the degree of their affective polarization. But anyway, so to summarize, in words, okay, so traditional media consumption reduces support for radical tactics and ideology for both movement supporters and opponents. It also reduces affective polarization among movement supporters. As I said earlier, these findings are not hypothesized, but they are in line with our understanding that mainstream news media tended to be conservative politically in Hong Kong, and consumption of these conservative media tend to reduce support for radicalism for both supporters and opponents, and also reduce affective polarization among movement supporters. Online media consumption does not relate to tactical or ideological radicalism. It also does not relate statistically significantly to affective polarization. So this analysis shows that online media consumption does not have a very significant impact on the dynamics of open polarization. In contrast, online forum consumption does relate to tactical and ideological radicalism among movement supporters, and it also relates to affective polarization among movement supporters, even though the relationship is mediated completely by tactical and ideological radicalism. This is in line, consistent with our expectation of how pro-movement media could lead to radicalism and affective polarization among movement supporters, even though the expectation that it could reduce opposition to radicalism and reduce affective polarization among the other side, among movement supporters and supporters. And social media use does not relate to tactical radicalism, but it reduces ideological radicalism among both movement supporters and movement opponents. Meanwhile, it increases affective polarization for both movement supporters and movement opponents. So it is consistent with our expectation that social media use will further strengthen opponents' opposition to radical ideology, though the finding about, as I mentioned, the finding about social media use impact on ideological radicalism among movement supporters actually contrary to expectation. Meanwhile, more importantly, the finding that social media use increases affective polarization for all people is in line with our expectation based on the presumption that social media facilitate mainly like-minded communication. And cross-cutting exposure reduces movement supporters' ideological and tactical radicalism, as well as increases movement opponents' opposition to the ideological radicalism. At the same time, it reduces affective polarization for all, with cross-cutting exposure from family being particularly effective. And all of these are consistent with expectations. Lastly, tactical and ideological radicalism relate positively to affective polarization among movement supporters and negatively to affective polarization among movement opponents. So these findings are also completely in line with our expectations. So to put everything together and just very quickly a few concluding remarks. What the analysis here shows is that media use and communication activities is indeed systematically related to affective polarization in the context of partisan movements. The role and impact of digital and social media depends on whether the media platform is partisan, is basically pro-movement in general or anti-movement in general, or instead of partisan, it's possible that some digital and social media platforms mainly facilitate communication among like-minded people. So not all digital and social media platforms matter in the same way. The impact of digital and social media also partly depends on how they shape people's attitude toward radical targets and ideologies. And the important point I want to make here is that media's impact needs to be understood in terms of how they are embedded in, how they relate to important aspects of movement dynamics. Here in this analysis, I'm using radicalism as one of the most important movement dynamics in the anti-Ideological to illustrate the point that we want to understand media's impact on within polarization through how it relates to some important aspects of movement dynamics. As I mentioned, radicalization itself has important implications on affective polarization. It should be reminded that radicalization has its own causes. I mentioned the analysis I did with my co-authors, and it's not just a product of media and communication activities. So again, the point here is that the social movement has its own series of dynamics driven by various factors, but digital and social media might come into the picture by relating to some of these dynamics in ways, and how they come into the picture, how they relate to these movement dynamics, also shape its role in the process of fulfilling polarization. Okay, so ultimately, the conclusion here is that huge protest movements have a tendency to polarize people. In both the case of the umbrella movement and the anti-Iran movement, the very simple one, straightforward point is that contention tends to produce a more polarized society. Of course, not surprising at all. It's a very straightforward point, but the extent of polarization, the extent and the ways in which contention tends produce a polarized society is also shaped by the configuration of the media landscape, shaped by people's consumption of the types of media channels and platforms, shaped by the linkage between media and core dynamics in the movement, in the protest movement, and of how the core dynamics of the movement impinge on affective polarization. So these are kind of my reflections and findings, about the two big movements in Hong Kong in the past 5 or 6 years. Now, of course, needless to say, this is ongoing research, and there have been, there are various limitations in these analyses for the use of a cross-sectional survey data set. I still haven't worked on integrating the survey data with digital media data. These will be the next step to go. But based on the current analysis, this is what I would like to share with you all today. So thanks a lot. I think my talk will end here, and questions and comments are welcome. Thanks a lot.
So, yeah, thanks for the presentation, and I really think this is a really promising and fantastic work. So I have 2 comments. So can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, cool, awesome. So I have 2 comments. The first one is about selective exposure. So you probably address this issue in the paper, but according to the presentation, I think you probably should have done more to address the concern that people who are like tuning to certain political media may already differ in their behavior and attitude, matter to their matter to the outcome of interest from people who don't. So it's probably because of this pre-existing difference in their political characteristic that explain the difference in their polarized or their attitude, rather than the consumption of the media. So I think you probably need to address this kind of like endogeneity issue. And the second one is that in the regression model, you control, for example, several characteristics of people that may matter to their political media use. So this somehow addresses the selective exposure problem, but if some of the control are influenced by the media consumption per se. For example, you control the trust in government, but probably people's media use will affect their trust in the government, and you control this post-treatment like variable in your model, and that's may bias your estimate. So I would suggest that you probably should just run a binary variable between the media use and the outcome of your interest, and incrementally include the control. I mean, so I think my concern here is the post-treatment control in your regression model. Yeah, and last one, I think so your finding basically show that there's no media effect on people's radical behavior. But I'm kind of curious whether you think there's a preference falsification in this question. That is, probably people are not feel very comfortable to reveal their radical or their attitude toward radical behavior, and there may have. So if this is the case, they may have like some systematic measurement error in this outcome variable, which may increase the standard error of your estimate, so that you. Even though there's some effect, but because the standard error is just too large to reject the null hypothesis. So I'm just curious. I mean, so you better know this than me, but I'm just wondering whether you think there's a preference falsification in this measurement. Thank you.
Okay, I have to say I didn't hear very clearly the last comment on the question about the variable radicalism. But let me put it this way. First of all, about selective exposure, obviously I would agree with you. I mean, also mentioned toward the end, I mean, actually, right at the end of the presentation, I would say, it's basically an ongoing study, kind of ongoing concern. Obviously, with a cross-sectional survey in June 2020, it's difficult to really differentiate between, or to interpret differentiate between media impact and selective exposure. I guess what the analysis shows is that, at least there is a central system, what they call relationship, linking media use and radicalism and opinion polarization together. In other words, I explain that in terms of how much of the relationships are matters of media effects, or how much of the relationship are matters of selective exposure. I would say that from the perspective of analyzing the dynamics of social movements, these relationships, no matter it's most likely to be a mixture of selective exposure and some media effects are looking for. And also it's significant to show that different types of media channels and communication would relate to radicalism and polarization differently. So it's basically an attempt here is to show how these things are kind of systematically related to each other in a nuanced manner, but really to differentiate between the classic question of media effects versus selective exposure. to really differentiate between two would require additional research using additional data and additional methodology for the field. And about randomism, I'm not sure I hear clearly the question is, it seems that it's about something related to the construction of the variables. So can I get some clarification on the question?
So, I mean, probably other audience have question also, and I can email my question to you later on.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure, thanks a lot.
You can even take your time. There will be one last question. Yes.
Hi, Francis. This is Trisha. I'm very, delighted to see your results. And I have one question about cross-cutting exposure. Because in your first study, you mentioned about that cross-cutting exposure goes beyond the social media, right? And then in your second research, basically when you examine the so-called cross-cutting exposure, you're only looking at online media. And it seems like you don't really find the relationship between the online media cross-cutting exposure and the effective polarization. So I'm just wondering, since in your first study, you're emphasizing the different aspects, and particularly mentioned about social media exposure, and why the second study, you did not tease out the differences between online media cross-cutting exposure effect and the social media effect? I'm just wondering why.
You mean why the effect of online media and social media are different?
Because I think your first study, you actually particularly emphasizing that we should looking at the different types of cross-cutting media exposure, because people always looking at social media only. And then so you expand the second study to online, offline, family, and friends influence. And I think these are fantastic. Yet, why don't you just also sort of compare the online in terms of social media? Because you did look into the technical, radicalization and ideological radicalization in terms of traditional media, online media, social media, and the foreign media. So I think if you could tease out the differences between online media and particularly looking at social media, I think that would be a very good contribution. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, but let me try to, again, I mean, maybe the connection is not, size, it's not very well, so I'm not sure if I really get completely the question, but I guess, to reiterate, I guess, in my, I think maybe Tricia, your point was something that there is indeed some intriguing discrepancy, so to speak, actually between the first study and the second study. Because in the first study, I put everything together, social, with just one item on communication by social media, and use that to represent digital social media as a whole. But then, when you put everything together, you see that social media use actually relates to actual extremity. Okay, and so in one sense related to political polarization. So in the first study also see that other communication variables like political discussion actually also relates to opinion polarization. Whereas in the second study, there are actually some differences in terms of which communication variables I'm using, because interpersonal political discussion actually does not exist in the June 2020 survey. I did not use interpersonal discussion in the model. But I guess when you combine the two together, I would say one interesting thing is that it seems that whenever a kind of media use or a communication activity involve interpersonal interaction, okay, then there is a more higher chance that that kind of communication activities will be more processed, okay, as a second, likely to be embedded in a network in a kind of echo chamber, etc., and that will drive opinion polarization. However, okay, if we are talking about other kind of media, traditional media, okay, in Hong Kong they are mostly conservative. Online alternative media, they are mostly pro-movement. And these are more conventional kind of one-way kind of media consumption. Okay, you basically just receive messages from the media organizations. And in that case, it seems like the tone or the attitude of the media organizations or the tone of the content still matters. So it seems like there is still, put aside, all these ideas about digital social media and there seems to be actually a distinction between, one-way kind of communication, media communication, and a more interactive kind of media communication. It seems like these two types are actually different, and that difference is about is basically grounded in the different ways the communications are just structured. The relationship between the user, the communicator, the person, and the people or organizations, institutions sending out the message. It seems that that structuring of that communication activity matters and explains the differences in terms of the relationship between the relationship with opinion polarization. I hope I can, I hope I want to answer your question in some way. But thanks a lot, Tricia, for the question. That's great question.
Thank you, Francis.
But due to the limitation of time, I'm afraid we have to stop here. That's again, thanks Professor Lee for his interesting research and sharing the latest information with us. Let's give Professor Lee a big applause.